All right, guys, just give just a couple more seconds here, get a few more people in. Okay. All right, let's get started. So first of all, if you can just show me on chat that you can hear what I'm saying. Hear lots of people entering, so good, awesome. All right, well, I hope everyone's doing okay. It looks beautiful outside. It's supposed to be like 14 outside, so hopefully everyone gets a chance to breathe some fresh air today. We are starting our next unit. So first of all, just a little bit about populations. I haven't handed back your other populations. I have 5 more to mark. So I'll get them back to you hopefully by about 10 after 3 today. And then you'll have those to look at, and then you can go through your test. So I've opened the test up. I did set it for be 2 hours to give you plenty of time to write it. Is there any questions about populations before we move on to endocrine? So just a couple of things before you go to write the test. Make sure you have your calculator, make sure you have your data booklet in front of you in order to do the calculations. And don't forget, this is a blend, right? This is all population, so there is going to be some population genetic stuff on it as well, okay? So make sure you have all of those. And like I said, about 10 after 3, I'll get those all back to you. I just haven't had a chance to finish them. All right, so we are going to start with the endocrine system today. So the endocrine system is all about hormones. What I'm going to do is not give you anything to do for homework for tonight. I just want to give you a chance to study and finish that populations. And then I'll post something after the Wednesday meeting and hopefully give you sort of a brief summary of stuff that you can do to keep yourself up to date with endocrine. So that's where we're at with that stuff. So I'm not going to give you homework tonight because I just would really like everyone to do really well in the population stuff. Marks are locked down. I probably talked to you about this last week already. They probably will be for a couple more days. They're still processing marks, so it takes them some time. So yeah, so that's where we're at with that. And then report cards will come out. And hopefully at some point tonight, I'll send everyone an email with things that are outstanding if there's some stuff that you haven't done, just to get everyone on track. All right, so endocrine. So let me just share my endocrine screen with you. And again, just let me know through chat if you have any questions for me. And we'll open this up. Okay, and okay, so we are officially starting our human body systems. So endocrine is all about hormones and how they work in our body. So we'll get that opened up just a little bit here, and that, and there we go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just go through all of the different glands you need to know. So part of what's in the program of studies is not just to know the theory, but to know where everything is. So it's very typical because, I mean, this is Bio30. You're not really going to get a lot of knowledge-based questions, and you guys know that because you've had me for long enough to know that. So often what'll be is not what is this pointed at, but rather what structures are being identified that are responsible for controlling blood glucose level, for example. Okay, so that type of stuff. So what we're going to do is just go through this diagram, and we're going to go through what the different parts are of the diagram. And I'll do just a little brief summary before we start kind of going through the notes on all of these parts. Okay, so we'll start learning a bit of a new language. Some of these terms you'll know and some you won't. So the first one is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a structure that's inside our brain. So it's kind of in our midbrain area. So there's this whole area that's sort of got this weird kind of shape, almost looks like a a seahorse, and the middle part of that seahorse is kind of where the hypothalamus is. So that's the structure that we see. Spotlight out here. That's the structure we see right here. Okay. And then the hypothalamus. So what do we need to know about that? Well, as far as the endocrine system goes, the hypothalamus is responsible for producing hormones. Okay. It helps us, it detects certain things that helps our body to maintain homeostasis. So you learned about homeostasis in Bio 20. So basically maintaining an internal balance. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So it helps us with that. And then it helps us by releasing hormones. So some of the hormones that the hypothalamus releases are sent throughout our entire body. And some of our hormones are just sent as signaling hormones. And they signal, so there's a little branch right here where the hypothalamus is connected to another structure, and that other structure is called the pituitary. Okay, so so we have the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is actually divided into two lobes, the anterior lobe, which is towards the front of our body, and the posterior lobe, which is towards the back of our body. But it's this teeny tiny little gland, and it's called the master gland because it's responsible for producing a lot of hormones that control a lot of the other endocrine glands, which is what we're looking at in this picture, throughout our body. Okay, so the hypothalamus sends messages to tell the pituitary to do the job. The hypothalamus also sends a few hormones that get stored in the pituitary, and we'll talk about the difference between those things. Okay. So the pituitary has this far-reaching effect or impact throughout our body. And because of that, we call it the master gland, even though there is a master of the master, and the master of the master is the hypothalamus. Okay? All right. Just for interest's sake, not because you need to know it, but in the back here, there's also a gland called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, sorry, I'm just going to get up and shut my door because someone's mowing their lawn. There we go. The pineal gland is actually responsible for producing a hormone called melatonin. Okay. How many of you have heard of melatonin? Just give me a little yes if you have. Just give me a couple words. Why does someone take melatonin? Yeah, the big thing with melatonin is that people take it to help them sleep. So if they're having a hard time sleeping at night, they'll often take melatonin. People will use it for jet lag. But melatonin is actually a hormone. Okay. So it's a hormone that's found in this part of our brain here. It's something called the pineal gland. This is not program of studies, but it is interesting to know about. And melatonin is actually released when it's dark out. So when it's dark out, melatonin is released and it helps us feel sleepy and go to sleep. Okay. Now that doesn't mean immediately when it's dark out, we go to sleep. Different people still have different limits with that. So some people who go to bed early, melatonin's produced a little earlier in the day. Some people it's a little later at night, but nonetheless, melatonin helps us to go to sleep, and that's why we take it. It doesn't help for everybody. Some people, I've just talked to students over the years, some people it works better for than others. But melatonin also for some people gets overproduced in the winter when we have less access to sunlight, and it leads to a condition called SADS, so seasonal affective disorder, where we get this overproduction of melatonin, and actually having too much melatonin can cause our body to have too little serotonin, which is this feel-good neurotransmitter in our brain. So it ends up causing depression over the winter months. Okay, so there's a little aside. So let's move on to some other parts here. So the next gland we're going to talk about is this one right here. So it's right in the base of the neck. Okay, and that's a gland that's called the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is responsible for producing a hormone called thyroxine, and then this other hormone called calcitonin. So thyroxine is a hormone that regulates our metabolic rate, so how quickly our body burns stuff up. Okay. Calcitonin is a hormone that regulates how much calcium is in our blood. Okay. And then there's 4 little dots that are embedded inside the thyroid gland. And these dots are referred to, so these little teeny tiny glands are referred to as the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands have a different function. Well, they work with calcitonin. So they produce a hormone called PTH, or parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone works with the thyroid, works with calcitonin to regulate our calcium ion concentration in our blood. All right, the next glands are right here. So what we see here is the kidneys. And kidney, we've probably heard the word renal referring to kidneys. And the word ad refers to something being on top of something. So these are called the adrenal glands. Adrenals. They're on top of the renal or kidneys. Okay. Adrenal. What hormone do you think they produce? Adrenal. Any ideas? Any guesses? Adrenaline. Adrenal glands make adrenaline. So we've all heard of adrenaline. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but we don't use the word adrenaline in Bio30. We use the word epinephrine, which means exactly the same thing as adrenaline. It's the same substance, but it's also called epinephrine, and that's our program of studies word for it. But epinephrine is the stuff that's in an EpiPen. So adrenaline is the stuff that's in an EpiPen. Okay. All right. So these are called our adrenal glands. They help us deal with stress. Okay. So we have stress. So we know adrenaline or epinephrine, that's part of our fight or flight response. And we'll talk about that in more detail a little later. But we've got another part of this gland that produces a couple hormones called cortisol and aldosterone. And those help us deal with longer term stress, like being in a pandemic and not being able to have graduation, that kind of stress. All right. Next we have pancreas. So the pancreas is responsible for producing two hormones. So the pancreas is sort of one of those auxiliary glands or accessory glands of our digestive system. Can anyone name one or two of the hormones that is produced by the pancreas? One for sure you've probably all heard of. No one's willing to take a shot at it? There we go. Yes, there's both of them. Larkin, insulin. Keenan said glucagon. Yes, yes, and yes. Those are the two hormones that are produced by the pancreas, and they work as a team. They work to control our blood sugar level. So if our blood sugar gets to be too high, insulin kicks in to bring it down. If our blood sugar gets to be too low, glucagon kicks in to bring it back up again. Okay. All right. Over here, what we're looking at, so we have a male, and then we have the female reproductive parts. So with the female reproductive parts, the endocrine gland of the female is called, or are called, the ovaries. And in the men, the testes. Okay. We are going to talk briefly about these two parts. And then when we get to the reproductive system, we'll spend a lot more time talking about them. So they both are responsible for producing hormones. Both of these structures produce hormones that are responsible for producing sex cells, okay, or hormones that are responsible for our secondary sex characteristics, okay. All right. So now let's move on and do some more detail with this. So homeostasis. So we all know what homeostasis means, or we should. Maintaining a balance with our internal environment, right? So if we have a chocolate bar, okay, our blood sugar level goes up. So our body has hormones that kick in this case insulin, which will bring that back down to normal. If we go outside and it's minus 40 out, our body has a reaction that happens to try to bring us back to our 37-degree body temperature. So we always have these things that are going on that we don't really know anything about that are helping to maintain homeostasis so we stay healthy, okay? When these systems break down, then that's what leads to problems. So homeostasis. Another thing we need to be aware of, and this is one of the parts of our program of studies, is how the nervous system and the endocrine system work together. So When we're thinking about homeostasis, and usually what I do is this to somebody, if I'm in a classroom, is our nervous system's really quick, right? If someone does this in front of you, you blink your eyes. It's really fast, a fast reaction. Someone throws a ball at your head, you go to block the ball or catch the ball, but we react. So the nervous system's a quick reaction to something. So we have electrical and chemical stimulation, and we'll talk about the nervous system a little later. Usually this is for short-term quick changes. Endocrine system takes longer. It's chemical. And for endocrine to happen, those chemicals have to travel through our blood. For the nervous system, mostly we're thinking about traveling through our nerves, which goes pretty quickly, right? It's like a little cable, electric cable. But when we talk about the endocrine system, it's really slow. So usually these are longer term changes. So when we think about this, think about things like puberty. Takes a while, right? Or even our adjustment to sugar. It takes a bit of time in order for our body to bring that level back down. It's not instantaneous. Okay. All right, so what are hormones? Well, hormones are chemicals. So the thing we need to remember about hormones, they do not have a brain. Okay, so hormones do not have a brain. They don't think about where they want to go. All right, so hormones are just chemicals that are released by certain glands in our body, like the ones we just talked about. Okay, hormones are produced, so these glands are called endocrine glands. So the glands that produce hormones are endocrine glands. So what happens is these glands produce hormones, and then the hormones get released into our blood, and then they travel through our circulatory system. Okay, but remember, they have no brain. They're just chemicals traveling through our circulatory system. They're not thinking about it, right? So testosterone, for example, so you guys know about secondary sex characteristics, and you know that testosterone causes a guy's voice to get deeper, right? And it does that because it causes the cells in the larynx to start dividing, the larynx thickens up. But testosterone is just a chemical. It's not in its little brain, because it doesn't have a brain, saying, oh, I need to target the larynx, because when I target the larynx is going to expand. It's not thinking anything. It's just randomly moving through the circulatory system. Okay? But hormones have target tissues. So how do we get a target tissue without the hormone having a brain? Okay? So the target tissue, that's the gland that the hormone has an effect on. Well, here's the thing. The only way a hormone can have an effect on a part of our body is if the part of the body has a receptor specific to that hormone. So last year you learned about enzymes and substrates, and how an enzyme and a substrate have this lock and key mechanism. And once they're together, then the chemical reaction can happen. The substrate changes, the enzyme leaves, right? Well, in this case, what happens is the hormone and the receptor come together. And when they come together, they cause this chain of reactions that leads to whatever purpose that hormone's supposed to have. So if I'm talking about the larynx, that chain of reactions is once testosterone locks into the cells in the larynx, that increases cell division. So the larynx starts to thicken. Okay? But only if that target. So that hormone, that testosterone, it's floating around the blood, and it's going to pass the skin, and it's going to pass all sorts of things that it's just going to bump against, right? It's not going to have any impact on those cells. But as soon as it hits a cell that has a receptor, now it's going to have an impact. Okay? Now that's going to cause this chain of reactions. So a hormone alone is useless. It's not until the hormone binds to the receptor. So when we talk about hormones having target tissue, their target tissue is tissue that has receptors for the hormone. Some hormones have very specific tissue in the body that they'll affect and nothing else. Other hormones, like insulin, affect pretty much every single cell in our body, which means every cell in our body has a receptor for insulin. Okay? All right. So feedback. So there's two types of feedback loops we need to be aware of. So there's negative feedback and positive feedback. So this one here is negative feedback. So what this means, basically we have these changes that go on all the time in our body. We go outside, we get warmer than body temperature or colder than body temperature. So our body reacts to bring us back to normal. We have a chocolate bar, our blood sugar level goes up, so our body brings us back to normal. Okay, so when we talk about negative feedback, it's really all about bringing us back to that optimal level. So something happens, okay, causes conditions to change. You eat your chocolate bar. Negative feedback brings that sugar level back to normal. So when I think about the way this is working here, okay, so here's our action. We eat a chocolate bar. What happens? Our blood sugar level goes up. Okay, so now insulin kicks in, our cells absorb more more sugar, our blood sugar goes down, brings us back to where we were supposed to be. Okay, so it's always about bringing us back. So the way we want to think about it is we have this optimal level, right? So whether that's blood sugar, whether that's body temperature, whether that's calcium ion concentration, but we have this optimal level for a whole lot of stuff inside our body. Okay, and if we go up, right, if something happens and that raises, negative feedback is all about bringing that back down. Okay, and if we get too low below that, then negative feedback is all about bringing us back up, right? It's all about bringing us back to normal or back to that optimal level. That doesn't mean we're going to stay at that level exactly. We're going to have these little fluctuations around that level. And that's what negative feedback's all about. So the best analogy for that is how your thermostat works. I think I have a little thing on that on the next slide here. Whoops. Oh, whoops, let's just finish this off. So allows the body to stay within homeostasis. So homeostasis is maintained typically through negative feedback systems. Positive feedback are a little different. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes, or in a half a minute. Okay, so we think about negative feedback. So this is referring to body temperature. So body temperature is 37 degrees, and we're always going around that 37 degree mark, right? So we have our optimal level. We have our optimal level here, and then we're fluctuating around that optimal level. Kind of think about your thermostat, right? So we have our thermostat, and let's say we have it set at 20 degrees Celsius, okay? And it starts to drop. So it starts to drop below that 20 degrees Celsius. Well, then our furnace kicks in and brings it back up, except our furnace overshoots it. Well, as soon as we get a little bit above the 20 degrees, our furnace shuts off. Well, then our house starts to cool, gets a little bit below, furnace kicks in. And we're always going around that normal. That's really what's happening with negative feedback. So our body system kind of works like how your thermostat works with your furnace. Okay. All right. Any questions about negative feedback? What that's all about? Okay. All right. So now let's take a look at positive feedback. Okay, so positive feedback is a little bit of a different system. So positive feedback is not about maintaining homeostasis. Okay. So here we have, with positive feedback, the result of an action stimulates further action. And then that action will continue until the stimulus is removed. So basically, we have some stimulus, something happens. There we go. We have some stimulus, something happens to change. Okay, and as long as that stimulus keeps happening, we're going to keep having this go on. Okay, and it's going to keep going until it can't happen anymore or the stimulus is removed. Okay, so let's think about an example of this. Fight or flight response. So a little kid runs in front of you, you're driving your car, you slam on the brakes, you just barely miss hitting the little kid. Okay, so we're going through these motions. You see the little kid out of your corner of your eye, right? So stress. We have this short-term, quick stress that's going on, and what are we going to do about it, right? As we see this kid come. So this action, right? This is what we're seeing happen. what's happening is we have our fight or flight response that's going on. So fight or flight. And as long as we're in that situation where we've got that kid and we're dealing with this situation, this action is going to keep happening. As soon as we don't hit the kid, we see the kid safe, it goes away. Okay. One of the examples when we talk about our bodies is breastfeeding. So how breastfeeding works is there's little nerve endings. So we have the nipple, but around the nipple, there's that brown area called the areola. And that's where all the nerves are. So that suckling action stimulates those nerves. So that's what's going on here. Okay, so that's suckling action. That suckling action causes a particular hormone to be released. We'll talk about that hormone a little bit later. So this hormone gets released. Okay, as long as the suckling action happens, then the hormone's released and milk keeps being released from the breast. But as soon as the suckling action stops, or resources depleted, there's no more milk, then it stops. Okay? There's no homeostasis for breast milk production. We don't just constantly release 50 mils a minute from our breast and then maintain that balance, right? We're either releasing milk or we're not releasing milk. Okay? So positive feedback is all about a stimulus. Once the stimulus is gone, that action doesn't happen anymore. Okay? I did put a little video here on the bottom. It's Amoeba Sisters if you want to clarify some of the differences between positive and negative feedback. All right, we're going to move on. Hypothalamus. All right, so hypothalamus, area of the brain that regulates the pituitary gland through nerve and hormonal stimulation, helps to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so we talked about that already. Stores some hormones that are, produces some hormones that are stored in the pituitary, and we'll talk about two of those. And then it also produces releasing hormones that help control the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so the front part, the front part of the pituitary. Okay, so releasing hormones that control the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary can't release hormones until the hypothalamus has sent releasing hormones to it. Okay. The pituitary, a small gland that's connected to and controlled by the hypothalamus. So it's referred to as the master gland because it releases hormones that affect other endocrine glands. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this image. So here we're looking at two parts of the pituitary. So this part here, which would be in the back part of our body, is the posterior lobe right there. Okay. So this particular part of the pituitary does not make its own hormones. The hormones from the hypothalamus pass through this little stalk into the pituitary where they get stored. And then when it's time to release, a message gets sent and they get released. There's two of these hormones that we need to know. So the first one is called oxytocin. Oxytocin has two jobs we need to know for Bio30. The first job is that it causes our uterine muscles to contract. So when a woman is in labor, so childbirth, so those uterine muscles contract, and that helps to force the child out of the uterus through the birth canal and outside the body. Okay, so oxytocin affects the uterine muscles, the muscles of the uterus. Oxytocin also affects the mammary glands. So those are the glands in the breast, and there's little ducts, and they contract, and that forces milk out of the breast. Okay. So mammary glands are also affected. So knowing that those two parts are affected by oxytocin, what do those parts have to have in order to be affected by oxytocin? Just write that in the chat. What do uterine muscles and mammary glands have to be affected by oxytocin? Think about what I said earlier. Okay, because not every cell is affected by every hormone. So what do uterine muscle cells? Exactly. Thank you, Shay. So uterine muscle cells have to have receptors for oxytocin. So uterine muscle cells and mammary gland cells have to have receptors for oxytocin, or oxytocin is not going to do anything to them. Okay, perfect. Okay, the kidneys. The next hormone is ADH. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. Now, you'll notice that there's a lot of acronyms that we're using for hormones. One thing you're going to want to look at is your data sheet. So there's this whole section of your data sheet which converts those acronyms to the long word, the long hormone name, and vice versa. So you only ever have to memorize the acronyms, but you have them both there on your data sheet. So just be aware that they're there. Okay, so what does ADH do? It's an antidiuretic hormone, which means it keeps us from peeing. A diuretic makes us pee, an antidiuretic keeps us from peeing. So how does it do that? It actually has target cells, so that means cells with receptors on the tubules, which are the collecting ducts of the kidneys. Okay. So what happens, ADH floats through the blood, moves around through the blood, attaches to those receptors. Basically what it does is it causes those collecting ducts in the kidneys to pull water back into the blood. Okay, so now we're going to get more water in the blood. Okay, so we're not going to pee out as much. We're going to have more water in our blood. Okay, so those are the two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the pituitary. All right, so now when we look over on this side, now we're looking at the anterior pituitary. Okay, now the anterior pituitary, in order for it to release hormones, it needs a releasing hormone message from the hypothalamus. So unless it gets this releasing hormone message, hormones don't get released from the anterior pituitary. The hormones we need to know for Bio30 are these ones. Oops, and LH. So TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. It stimulates the thyroid to release a hormone called thyroxine, which helps control metabolic rate. ACTH affects the adrenal cortex, which is the shell part of the adrenal glands, and tells it to release two hormones, cortisol and aldosterone. FSH and LH affect our gonads, our testes and our ovaries, telling them to produce sex cells and telling them to produce sex hormones. Growth hormone makes us grow. Prolactin is for the production of milk. Oxytocin is for the release of milk. Okay, so oxytocin is about the release of milk. Prolactin is about the production of milk. Okay. Come on. There we are. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I know it's really, really small on the PowerPoint, but clear what I did here. So I'm just going to focus on the posterior pituitary for right now. So in the posterior pituitary, now this image is a little bit reversed. So the posterior pituitary appears at the front of the image, even though it should be at the back of the image. But nonetheless, let's take a look here. Let me just open my chat again. What I would like you guys to do is, first of all, through the chat, we're going to talk about what these parts are. So let's see where we're at. Perfect. So let's look up here. What is this? Darn it. The part I have the spotlight on. What is that called? What do you think? It's joined to the part below it. It controls the master. Awesome. Thank you, Keenan. The hypothalamus. So our very first part is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus controls, produces, well, in this case, we're just talking about the posterior pituitary. So it produces hormones that get stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so there's our pituitary gland and there's the posterior pituitary. All right, so we just talked about two hormones in our little diagram we did. So here's one hormone. Here, I just told you what it was, darn it, is oxytocin. So the image that I'm looking at here is a uterus, and oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions, and it also stimulates the release of milk. So I don't have a picture of a mammary gland there, but it stimulates the release of milk. So oxytocin does both of those jobs because both of those structures have receptors for oxytocin. Okay. Now, if I look here, let me move this around. What hormone is this one talking about? So just type in, what hormone is this one talking about? Okay, what hormone's targeting these structures? Right, so we're looking at ADH. ADH targets specifically the kidneys. Okay, so the hormone we're talking about there is ADH, and it stimulates reabsorption of water by the kidneys, which means water is coming from the kidneys and going back into the blood. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's talk about these particular hormones here. Whoops, let's get me a little smaller. Still learning how to use all this stuff. There we go. Okay. So the posterior lobe. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary does not produce hormones, but it stores and releases hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. Okay. And the two hormones that get stored there we just talked about are ADH and oxytocin. Okay, so ADH. So ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. So ADH, antidiuretic. So again, on your data sheet, you have ADH and you also have antidiuretic. So you have both of those terms. So a diuretic makes us pee, so an antidiuretic makes us so we don't pee. Okay, so it's released when the hypothalamus detects the solute concentration of the blood is too high. Okay, so we have too much solute in our blood. And a solute is anything that dissolves in the blood. We could be talking about a mixture of sugars and salts and calciums and whatever. So really the way we want to think about it is our water concentration in our blood is too low. We don't have enough water in it. Okay, so solute is too high or water is too low. So we're thinking about that. We are not thinking about a specific solute. We're just thinking in general. There's too much stuff. The waters or the blood is too concentrated. Okay, so we have to do something to alleviate that. So what happens is ADH binds to the collecting ducts of the kidney. So for it to bind, there's a receptor, right? A receptor for ADH, and it locks into that receptor. And it causes water to be reabsorbed back into the blood. So we have to remember what our kidneys do, right? Our kidneys filter all the blood in our body. And then that water, right? All the good stuff goes back to where the blood and the toxins we pee out. But then we've got the water. Well, is it good or bad? It's kind of neither, right? So when we have high ADH, that water goes back to the blood, right? If we have low ADH, that water goes to the urine side. So where that water goes is very dependent on ADH in our body. Okay? So what happens, the water goes back to our blood, so that solute that was in our blood is getting diluted. So now it's less concentrated. So we've increased the water concentration in our blood and we've decreased the solute concentration in our blood. Okay? So we think about what the impact of that is. Well, if we have more ADH, more water is going back to our blood, so that means we're not going to pee out as much. That also means our blood pressure is going to go up because there's more volume pushing against the sides of our blood vessels, so we'll have a higher blood pressure. Okay? High ADH also causes our blood vessels to constrict. So this is another way. So ADH is often released through a blood pressure. If our blood pressure is too low, ADH will get released because it'll cause more water to go back into our body. And it'll cause our blood vessels to constrict, which increases our blood pressure as well. So we would see something like this happen. Maybe someone has a hemorrhage, right? So we're bleeding out all this blood. We're losing this blood volume. So our body's trying to compensate for that by forcing more water back into our blood and constricting our blood vessels to maintain our blood pressure. Okay. All right. So solute is low, ADH is produced. Or sorry, when solute concentration is high, ADH is produced to dilute it so it gets low. But once it gets too low, right, we're getting below normal, then ADH is shut off, right? Just like when we reach the temperature we want in our house, the thermos shuts off, or the furnace rather shuts off. So ADH is inhibited when our solute concentration is low. Water is no longer being reabsorbed back into our blood. Okay, so part of what we need to understand with the program of studies is how to draw a feedback loop. So a feedback loop is basically just a step-by-step what's going on with this hormone. How does this hormone work? So when we start a feedback loop, we start with what stimulates the production of that hormone, and then we kind of go through the glands and the different hormones, the steps of it that loop back to the very beginning. So let me demonstrate with the feedback loop for ADH. So first of all, let me change my pen color here. We'll start with blue. Okay, so our stimulus for ADH production is our solute concentration is too high. Okay, so we have a high solute concentration. Okay, so what happens is that high solute concentration actually has to be detected. And that gets detected by these little cells inside of our hypothalamus called osmoreceptors. Okay, so it's detected by the hypothalamus. Okay, now, actually, I'm going to just do this here. We'll draw a picture. There we go. So it's detected by the hypothalamus. Sorry, this pen doesn't work the best. I'm going to shorthand it because it's hard to write. It's detected by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to send a message now onto the next part of this, right? So high solute in our blood, okay? Too much solute. Detected by the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is going to send a message on. Where does the hypothalamus send its message? What's that next part of that chain? What do you think? What structure does the hypothalamus send its message to? Yeah, the next gland is the pituitary gland. Exactly right. Okay, good. So the hypothalamus is going to send its message on to the pituitary. And again, I'm going to shorthand this because it's hard to write. So the pituitary gland is going to release a messenger. What's the messenger that gets released by the pituitary gland? What's the pituitary gland going to release as a result of this? Any ideas, guys? Okay. So the pituitary gland is going to release ADH. ADH. Okay. And where's the ADH going to go? What's the target for the ADH? Yeah, awesome. So the ADH is going to go to the kidneys. Okay. So we're starting with our stimulus, right? Here's our stimulus detected by, so what gland detects it? And then we basically go to the series of messages that are leading to the end result of how this hormone works. Okay, so the ADH is released. It goes to the kidneys, targets the kidneys. Now, as a result of that targeting of the kidneys are going to reabsorb water. We don't have to say that in our feedback loop. We just have to talk about what the end result is. So the end result is we have a decreased solute concentration in the blood. Okay, now there's one last part to this that's super important because this is a feedback loop, which means we have to loop back. So what's happening here is we have this negative feedback that's happening. We usually indicate this with a line and then a little negative sign, okay? because that low solute concentration gets detected by the hypothalamus and tells the hypothalamus, hey, we got to stop this, and tells the pituitary, hey, stop releasing ADH. We're good now. Okay, solute concentration's low, we're done. But once the solute concentration goes up again, this starts again. Okay, so a feedback loop always loops back. Okay, any questions about that? All right, so let's just, okay, I know we'll go over by a couple of minutes this class. Just a couple though. Get rid of that and go on to my next slide here. Okay, there's a couple of conditions associated with ADH. There's one that's called diabetes insipidus. Now, often when we think of the word diabetes, we think about diabetes that has to do with sugar. That's diabetes mellitus, and we will talk about that in some detail a bit later. But diabetes insipidus is a condition that comes from your body having either too low of ADH or isn't responding to ADH. So if we don't have enough ADH, what do you think our symptoms would be? What do you think would happen to our body? Like, what would someone notice about themselves if they didn't have enough ADH? What would be a symptom of that? Any ideas? Yeah, you'd pee a lot, right? Yes. So lots and lots of bathroom trips and probably a lot of dehydration, right? So you'd feel super, super thirsty all the time because you'd be dehydrated and you'd be peeing all the time. I was doing a bit of reading on diabetes insipidus, and sometimes people with diabetes insipidus can urinate up to 16 liters a day, which is 4 great big milk jugs of urine every day. Well, if they're losing that much liquid, that means they have to drink that much liquid to make it up. So you'd be completely overwhelmed with thirst. Okay, so high urine volume and a lot of thirst. And then another thing just to talk about with ADH and what affects ADH is alcohol and caffeine are known as diuretics. And that's because they mess up with the release of ADH. So when you drink a lot of alcohol, you'll notice that you pee a lot. When you drink a lot of caffeine, you'll notice you increase how much you pee, how much you urinate. And that's because these are diuretics. So they actually increase our urine volume and lead to dehydration. So when we think about someone drinking too much and getting a hangover, well, alcohol is poison, so our liver has to process that, and it processes it into a type of organic called aldehyde. And those aldehydes are going to have a really high concentration in our body because we're peeing out all the water. And that's part of the reason why we start feeling really sick, right? Okay, and I think that is, let's just look at my next slide. Yeah, we'll stop there, okay? Any questions at all about anything, populations, and any of this stuff? Okay, so in about 20 minutes or so, I'll release that population ecology number 3 back to you. Like I said, I've got about 5 more to mark, and then I'll get that back to you guys. So the population unit exam is open, and I won't post anything until after next class as far as the endocrine system goes. So enjoy your little break of writing your test, and we will see you guys on Wednesday. And if you think of a question, just send me an email. Okay, no worries. All right, don't forget to enjoy the weather. It looks beautiful out there. We'll see you guys Wednesday.